A few months ago, I slipped out of work for a little while to attend a memorial service, even though it was being held at a crematorium in town, which I had a very creepy experience in a couple years ago. And then when I got there, I learned it was led by a hired preacher who was using a generic and somewhat, to my mind, demeaning liturgy. The service, you see, was for my neighbor, and I went because he actually tried to be my neighbor. Now, on my street, we don't have a lot of interaction with one another, though as a person who daily walks 2 dogs, I probably have a little bit more than most people, and I at least kind of know who goes with what house mostly. But this neighbor, when he moved in, he decided he would make a directory for all of us on the street as kind of a basic neighborhood watch, so we could kind of look out for things for each other. And because of him, for many years, I at least knew the names of the people that I saw when I was walking the dogs or picking up poop or whatever I was doing. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? A couple of you were singing with me. And the thing is, I would venture to sing that even after this gorgeous, can we just say thank you, music that we just had? For 2 reasons. One, I warmed up with our family choir today. That was good. But also because Fred Rogers never sang it in a particularly tuneful way. Now, some of us do know that song. I was a child of just about the target age when it came out originally, and I remember that I was a little skeptical of the whole thing. Fred Rogers was very earnest, and the part of me that would later skim by punk rock and alternative fiction was already a little jaded. I lived in a home where we didn't do emotions, and I had no adult to watch it with me and help me understand the more nuanced things and let its lessons sink in. So I found it more than a little confusing, preferring the slapstick rowdiness of the other new children's program, which came on right after that on our schedule, Sesame Street, where my sister and I had this routine where we would pretend to be the cook falling down the steps with all the cakes by falling on my grandmother's antique couch, probably something that it didn't appreciate. But as Carvel Wallace, the Black writer and creator of the Finding Fred podcast, put it, it is hard to imagine and understand that the answers to life for a diversity of kids were going to come from, as he put it, this old white guy in a zip-up cardigan who plays with puppets. Yet decades after Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood stopped filming, after Fred Rogers died, in fact, his work enjoyed a renaissance. And I think it's because we so need resources to think about how to be good neighbors. This man, who wanted kids to have access to their emotions, a Presbyterian minister and a counselor, who wanted to teach the Jewish and Christian value of neighborliness, this gentle person who agonized when violent events happened in the world and especially worried about their impact on children. This person who had once had his puppet character, Daniel the Striped Tiger, ask, "What is assassination?" after the death of Bobby Kennedy. This man had a mission, and he was trying very hard. In the very first episode, when the trolley moves into the world of make-believe, it comes to the kingdom where an angry King Friday is building a wall to keep out people and ideas. Sound familiar? The truth is, we only have to listen to the agonizing news of our world to understand that we could use someone speaking in a slow and deliberate tone to teach us about neighborliness and empathy, to be reminded of the story of the Good Samaritan, which Reverend Rodney shared with us today. As someone raised outside of religion and certainly biblically illiterate for most of my life, when I heard the story the first couple times, I always understood it to be about the question that Jesus asks the lawyer at the end, who was a good neighbor? I totally missed, for many, many times, that other question about who is my neighbor, which probably is the one we need to focus on most today. As Carville Wallace notes, Fred Rogers might have looked silly with his pants rolled up, stomping in a plastic wading pool with his black friend with whom he shared a towel in the 1960s. Yet at a time when debates about integrating pools were raging around the country, what he was doing was a lot more edgy than my 7-year-old self could understand. Do I consider now the man who lives a few houses down from me, whose pickup truck sprouted a flag in January of 2021, a neighbor? Does he consider me one? Does it matter if we exchange greetings and I admire the bicycle skills of his young daughter, which I do? Do I agree with some of my long-term neighbors who are scared by the people moving in who are now renters and who don't keep up their yards at the standard that others feel they should? Do I consider the people addicted to substances who I see on our streets adjacent to my property almost every day? There's some people I see almost every walk with my dog, same people. Are they my neighbors? Do they consider me to be their neighbor? I know some of their faces better than I actually know the faces of the people who live on the houses on my street. Now, when I was in my 20s and living a wildly different life from the one I do now, I participated from time to time in another neighborhood watch. I lived in a neighborhood then where there were big lots, big houses, often set back behind trees, so the neighbors had organized a patrol. And everybody took a day off from work every month to patrol the neighborhood for a day with a notebook that had everyone's car listed and where you had a walkie-talkie with a direct line into law enforcement. And I remember as a young 20-something driving around in my then partner's Chevy Blazer, wondering what I would actually do if there was something wrong at one of those addresses. What defined neighbors there was very clear. It was adjacent property. And others were not seen as neighbors and were in fact the reason for the neighborhood patrol. Now, the roots of the word neighbor do translate to one who lives near. Yet our world today means that media and common interests and dangers may redefine what is near. There are many people that live near us psychically and spiritually today. Do we consider the Ukrainians our neighbors, the Russians? Do we consider the Israelis our neighbors, the Palestinians, the leader of their government that are extreme just as ours were a few years ago? Do we consider their children and elders our neighbors? The leaders of their government, their children, their elders. Why it matters who we consider a neighbor is this: that we extend our empathy to those with whom we consider to be within our circle of embrace. And there is a Canadian nonprofit study from 2017 which talks about what reduces our empathy. And I'm going to ask you to consider these factors. 1, social factors including obedience to authority, where people may act in cruel ways because they're following orders. 2, ideology, where people may hurt others because they're in a grip of a strong belief system that they are the only ones who are morally right. 3, group relations, where a group may collectively hold a rigid belief that one's own group, which is the in-group, is superior to another's group, which is the out-group, and which, in extreme cases, which we see more and more, can lead us to dehumanize members of the other group. 4, early neglect and abuse, where people might grow up feeling that others do not care for them, so they do not need to care for others. And finally, trauma, where if you feel under threat or are actually under threat, you may not be able to empathize with others because all you can do is think about how to protect yourself and your loved ones. The genius of someone like Fred Rogers, who can see many people as their neighbors, is something that we need to think about again in our world. Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an author and an influencer and an icon for many younger activists, observes about the U.S. responses to the tragic events in Israel and Palestine. I can tell that a lot of the energy is flowing into online battles, as if that is the only battle where we can help. She encourages people to make their voices known as Morgenthau from Jewish Voices from Peace does as well, quoting Rabbi Miriam Grossman, who says, "We don't wait to feel hopeful," and then adds his own words, Morgan's words, "We act for justice as a way to move towards each other." Adrienne Marie Brown points out that seeing an issue as too complicated to get involved or weigh in is a way of dismissing the humanity involved. In a special episode of her podcast, How to Survive the End of the World, she says, "All we need to know right now is that we are against genocide. Our world needs us to care about one another, to feel one another's pain. The idea that those who make us feel pain are always wrong is a dangerous idea." Now, I don't need anything else on my to-do list, but at my neighbor's service, I decided I will, by the end of this calendar year, and that's coming up, reach out to my neighbors and take up where my deceased neighbor left off. I will leave flyers at every door, and update that roster. And if nothing else, we'll know each other's name when we pass each other on the streets. Maybe someday we'll have that 4th of July picnic that I keep thinking of organizing but never get around to every year. And when our Faith Without Walls puts together gift bags for those on our streets this holiday season, I'll be looking to make a brief contact with some of my other neighbors. And last week, I took a moment and emailed the White House and let them know that 10,000 dead in 1 month in one embattled region of the world is too many, and to ask our president to call for a ceasefire, the same request that Jewish Voices for Peace and so many other advocacy groups have made. We are our ancestors' prayers. Today, our most active friendships might be found states away or even oceans away. Our screens bring us the tragedy of the whole world into our lives. Like the Good Samaritan, today we know we are our ancestors' prayers, and that everyone, without exception, every human life is the life of a neighbor.